Hey folks! I know there's a lot of Metroidvania fans in my audience, so I figured it was about time to switch gears and tackle one. Specifically, Francis Vace's Trash Quest, since I'd received a gift copy a while back. As far as overarching scale goes, this would probably be more of a Microvania than anything, but that does beg a certain question in and of itself. Was this quest quick and clever fun, or was it hot trash? I'm your host Arlian, let's find out together. Starting with the story, or rather the premise, I guess, since the opening segment for the game more or less exists to establish that A, you're on a spaceship, the Deliverance, B, you're a raccoon that smuggled itself aboard, and C, the ship's AI wants to fix that. And that's about that, really. There's no twists or turns to look forward to, only a trash depot to trip into at the tail end of the experience. So yeah, calling this a story-light experience is a bit of an understatement. Which is fine, since the reason I picked up this title was for the gameplay. After all, I was curious about how much content was crammed into an experience meant to be bite-sized. And off the hop, things seemed simple enough, with a shoot button you can hold and a basic jump. That said, it wasn't long before the game began to introduce a bit of nuance. For instance, while you start with only one jump charge, it's a bit more flexible than you'd think, since you can also trigger it while falling, allowing for a bit more leeway exploration-wise, and also opening the floor for trickier platforming. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, because the game continues to provide more options as you progress forward. While some are straightforward, like extra jump charges, later on you also get things like a hover and a glide, which can all be chained together for a surprising amount of flexibility on the mobility front. A fact that the game happily leans into because there is a lot of platforming puzzles in Trash Quest. That's not to say there isn't combat, but you're actually able to bypass a lot of the basic enemies, which also meant that the bulk of my deaths were tied to some of the more involved bits of, well, platforming and maneuvering around some of the more involved segments of the station. Well, that and the bosses, while there aren't that many encounters, the ones that do exist do a solid job of testing the entirety of the player's skills and abilities, and frequently took me a few tries to learn because of how different each encounter was from their peers. It helps, too, that the game is very careful not to offer much in the way of bonus power-ups, to the point that even if you collect all of the ones that are currently available to you, you won't feel overpowered as compared to your opposition. Well, until the final fight, but anyways, the way it does this might gull some fans of the Metroidvania genre because, well, Trash Quest is sort of linear as far as an experience goes. While you do have a ship to explore, the central path you wind up taking doesn't have much wiggle room for alternate routes. When you double back to an earlier area with a new ability, it's generally to progress the main story, and when you do find something optional to engage with, well, to call it limited in scope would be an understatement. Rather than providing optional zones to fiddle around with, Trash Quest secrets take the form of relatively bite-sized puzzle platforming rooms. Small, one-off nooks which provide very challenging obstacle courses for you to conquer in order to gain power-ups to your health, damage, or fire rate. I do have to give them credit though, they are fairly well crafted, so I did find them a treat to engage with, especially since I was coming into right when I was first able to. So they did a great job of testing the full extent of my kit. That said, if you are hoping for more in-depth exploration, well, the game's design ethos on this front is fairly interesting, partly because it's built around the idea of having a singular central checkpoint, which you snap back to whenever you die. What this means is, whenever you veer slightly off the beaten path, if your reward isn't a challenge room, it's a shortcut whose sole purpose is to make the ship a little more porous so you can zip around the interior a little bit faster whenever you die or you're trying to get back to an earlier segment. Well, okay, again, beyond the bosses, they are thankfully an exception to the rule and just snap you back to their room entrance after they finish brutalizing you, so there is that. In any case, it's an interesting idea, but it does mean a lot of what you're doing when you're exploring is just making your inevitable retreading a bit easier. Something which becomes especially noticeable once you leave the Deliverance. Because, well, yeah, while I started to feel a bit powerful at the end of the base game, things don't actually end there. Once the game's been clear and you see the credits, you can exit the game and come back in, and you'll be at the starting point. But more importantly, you'll be able to go up to the room above the starting point where a brand new door has opened up, leading to a sister ship. And it is a very different experience. The kid gloves are often there. It's less a climb in difficulty and more of an outright spike, as it introduces new obstacle types, challenging enemy arrangements, and platforming segments which are far more precise in nature. All of which are non-optional, since the second ship outright eschews the exploration elements of the initial experience, turning this segment into a purely linear, focused action platformer, which will happily murder you over and over again. And the bosses they just exemplify this trope to the extreme. Each of the post-game encounters are scaled to the point where even with all of the upgrades from the base game, they're incredibly tanky. There's no brute force your way through them, and their damage is scaled up, ensuring that you're obliged to learn their patterns, and also providing far less leeway for mistakes than their base game peers. It's just brutal, but if you're looking for a challenge, it certainly does provide, and there was some interesting unlocks once you're done if you're looking to go and revisit some of the earlier fights, or if you are a nutcase, fighting every single one of the bosses back to back in a boss rush, which I was not going to do. Anyways, yeah, so normally this is about the time that I switch gears to talk visuals, but first I really want to gush about the soundtrack here because the game has a decent array of catchy tunes to listen to as you traverse its various zones. Unironically, it was these background beats that really helped to salve my wounded ego after certain platforming challenges repeatedly buried me. Unironically, they are some of the most memorable elements from my time with Trash Quest. Like, that's not to say I don't have anything nice to say about the visuals, but on that front, my comments are largely, it's very cute and left me nostalgic for the Game Boy. Like, I do appreciate the smaller details, like the raccoon getting a different colored speed line when he's able to eventually shoot a charged blast, but otherwise, the areas and enemies aren't as distinct as the soundtrack. But yeah, that's the minutia, so let's finish this off. First off, as far as a gameplay experience goes, I did think this was a fun way to spend an evening. Exploring the ship and navigating the various platforming elements was a lot of fun. There were some genuinely challenging segments to run up against, optional and otherwise, and the boss encounters were decently varied. And I couldn't help but appreciate the shortcuts heavily reduced the tedium that backtracking entailed. That said, as far as Metroidvanias go, I was considerably less impressed. Yes, there was some light exploration elements, but largely it boiled down to using an ability to enter a challenge room, and that was the extent of it. And when I got to the latter half of the game, those elements vanished entirely, so it makes it a bit tricky for me to really classify it as a Metroidvania, despite the fact that it was presented to me that way. That said, if I judge it purely on the merits of being an action platformer, I can safely call this game a hit. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you have something to say, leave a comment. If you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews and interviews, hit subscribe and the bell. For a link to my Discord, the Crit Hit Cauldron, check the description. And check out my Patreon to see reviews early and support the channel like Shrimp Mania, Greenwich Babby, and Andy Noted have. Also, I have a merch house with neat swag like Crit Hit coffee mugs and shirts. So, yeah, no. That said, I'll catch you all in the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.